So thank you to the volunteers. We really could not have pulled this meeting off without you. And also from Schneider Group Associates, who have been the backbone of all of our planning. So it's my pleasure to introduce Randy Olson. He is going to be speaking tonight about the theme of science communication. Randy's no stranger to coming and talking to scientists. He got his Ph.D. in marine biology in Harvard in 1984 and was a tenured professor at University of New Hampshire. And he threw it all away and went to film school at USC. He's done 2 feature films, one on climate change and the other on intelligent design. And he's also written several books on science communication, or at least the process of communicating complex issues to the public. I'd like you to welcome Randy Olson, who's going to hobble over here because he sprained his ankle on the way to the airport or something.
I'm not Randy. Yeah, totally.
Great, thanks. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Great to be here. Thanks very much for teaching me something about the Willamette, damn it. And lots to cover here. There's the clicker there. And let's get going. I am here to talk to you about the story in science, not the story of science, not the story around science, but in fact the idea that story and narrative is all the way through the whole world of science. And this is kind of my big message nowadays, is the importance and need for narrative training, I believe, at the very beginning levels of science. I think this is something that's not happened in the past, and the time has come now for this to be integrated into basic science education. Thanks very much for that introduction, Lucinda. And as she mentioned, I did all these crazy things, went to film school, made a bunch of films, been working in and around Hollywood for 20 years. And then in 2009, wrote a first book that was kind of my first expression of everything that I had learned by going off into this other world, into this more narrative world. A book titled Don't Be Such a Scientist, Talking Substance in an Age of Style. And that book got nice reviews, but after a while people began to point out that it mostly was a critique, mostly talking about the problems of how science gets communicated. Didn't really offer up very much for constructive advice or solutions, but it did point in one direction, which was the biggest chapter was called Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller, and it was my instinct that I thought that was probably the best way to go, was to work on the idea of narratives. And it led then to my creating a workshop for the past 4 years with 2 of my colleagues in Hollywood, Dory Barton and Brian Palermo. And then last year we published a book called Connection, Hollywood Storytelling Meets Critical Thinking. And this actually was offering up constructive pathways, models, ideas for how to improve narrative. And now I'm working on a new book that'll be published next fall from University of Chicago Press. The tentative title is Houston, We Have a Narrative. And this will be applying these ideas of narrative specifically to the world of science, kind of this whole agenda that I'm recommending. And that's a lot of what this talk will be about, comes from the content of that. But let me begin with a story, which is last summer, I was invited to, by this friend of mine, Megan Bailiff, to take part in a plenary panel discussion at the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation meeting in San Diego, happening in November. And she invited me by saying, you know, this would be a chance for you to present a lot of your communication stuff and storytelling and to 1,000 people in a big ballroom. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a good opportunity, I'll do it. And then the summer went by, and then about 6 weeks before the event, I finally took a look at the website and saw the actual plenary panel I'd signed up for. And there were 2 other members of the panel, the first of whom was Gary Griggs, who's a longtime coastal geologist at UC Santa Cruz, and then Mike Orbach, who is a marine policy expert. And these are 2 of the most knowledgeable voices on sea level rise today. And in fact, that was the title of the panel, was Responding to Sea Level Rise, a topic that I know nothing about. And I was baffled. Why was I put into this panel? So I called up Megan and sort of said, what's the deal? And she said, well, no, we want you to come in. These 2 guys are dying to have you come in and do a makeover on their presentations and bring in your storytelling stuff, you know, and we'll rework everything. And I thought that sounded great. So I said, okay. So I started a group email with them and started offering up my suggestions. You know, I wanted to have us tell stories as kind of a group of the 3 of us, all together and getting up and down throughout the session. And immediately they both began with kind of pushback, like, you know what, we don't have that much time, and actually we don't really, it turned out they weren't that eager to do this. Big surprise. And I pushed a little further, and then I began to realize something that I've come to realize a lot with working with people, which is that presentations are a very personal issue. You spend a lot of time yourself developing a presentation. Furthermore, both these guys are excellent speakers. They didn't need any help with communications. And so I began to get the sense this was not going to work out. And then finally, I threw out one big suggestion, and one of them, I won't say who, wrote back and said, look, all four of us have done plenty of these talks. There's no need to fiddle with the recipe, how we give talks. And at that point, I figured I would end this discussion because I could see that it wasn't going to work. So I figured I'd just take a hand grenade and throw it into the mix. And so I wrote back and said, well, only one of us has more than 2 decades of experience in mass communications. And I got exactly the response. In fact, it took less than 2 minutes. I won't say which of the 2 guys wrote this back, but this is how his email began. Well, Randy, ... aren't we special? And at that point, I figured it was time for a breather, and so I kind of gave it overnight, and then the next morning I called up Megan and said, you know, I think we got a problem here. And I will tell you what that led to shortly, but let's start talking about this dynamic of narrative and what I was trying to do with them. And narrative is as old as the hills. It goes back to, you know, the Greeks 2,000 years ago. And at its core, it's relatively simple. It's kind of got a tripartite structure to it. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is called the Hegelian dialectic, and it's really the underpinning of logic and argumentation and reasoning and all these sorts of things. And at its simplest of all levels, it's just not much more than the idea of here's the state of things, here's what I observe, and here's my synthesis pulling these 2 things together, trying to reconcile them. Where have you heard that structure before? Pretty much with every scientific paper you've ever written. That's what the science journals force you to do. Same basic process. Tell us what the state of the literature is, the existing knowledge. Tell us what you did, methods and results. Then try and pull it all together and give us a synthesis of everything. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is at the core of it all. So this is the way I'm going to structure what I present to you here, according to these 3 basic sections. So the state of knowledge. And as a kind of preface comment here, I'm finding nowadays a lot of times I give talks to groups of scientists, a certain number of scientists kind of immediately check out and say, oh, he's a communications guy, and I never intend to get involved with communicating to the public. I'm just a researcher. There's nothing in this that's relevant to what I do. And to the contrary, what I'm talking about here applies to all aspects of science. I hope to convince you of that as we get into this. Is not just for outreach people, because science itself is a narrative process. And again, this is something I think that needs to be explained at square one in science education. So this is your random basic definition of what the scientific method is, taken off of any old website that has definitions, and you'll find lots of them. This is as good as any. This one says, the scientific method is a method of investigation in which a problem is first identified in observations, experiments, or other relevant data, and then used to construct or test hypotheses that purport to solve it. And there you have the basic elements, which is problem and solution. That's what science is. It's an idea, it's a process of going out there, searching around, making observations, posing a question. That question then becomes the problem that you want a solution to, namely the answer to that question. And that's what's at the core of doing science, problem and solution. Now, in the humanities, those people on the other side of your college campus, for most of you, at the core of what they do is basically narrative, it's storytelling, it's all the oral traditions, it's everything, it's novels over the ages. And one of the most important people in the entire field of narrative was Joseph Campbell, who in the 1940s I think he was one of the first people to ever bring a very analytical, more scientific approach to what has traditionally been a much more intuitive discipline, which is the telling of stories, narratives. And he began looking at all these cultures around the world and different religions and cultures and the way in which they tell stories, and he began to see similarities. He began to see clear patterns. And in the same way, just think in terms of phylogeny, the idea that you see all these different species that all track back to common ancestors, he began to see a commonality of this structural pattern, which he eventually identified as more or less a single story, which he referred to as, in his famous book in the late 40s, Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he called it the monomyth, the idea of the singular template that over the ages gets radiated and modified all around the world, but really is at the core of all of this sort of oral communication or the telling of stories. And he described this monomyth in its simplest of all terms as the idea that a story is nothing more than a circular process, a circular journey. It starts in one place, goes full circle, and comes back around. And he talked about these two worlds that a story goes through in the journey of a character or a group of characters. And the first world is called the ordinary world. That's where it all begins. It's a nice, comfortable, relaxed place that, you know, nothing is troubling you. But then something happens which then rockets the character into what he called the special world. And the special world is far more exciting. It's invigorating, it's exhilarating, it's wonderful, but you can never really be relaxed there. So it becomes a problem being in the special world. And as soon as you're there, the main thing you want is simply to get yourself back to the ordinary world. And eventually you have to undertake a journey to try and figure out how you're going to get back to that ordinary world. And you finally solve that problem and you're back to the ordinary world. So I could tell you the story of a little girl who grows up on a farm in Kansas and her life is boring, but then one day a tornado sweeps her to the land of Oz, and as soon as she lands there, what's the first thing she wants to do? She just wants to get back to her ordinary world of Kansas. She undergoes a journey and learns some things along the way in that journey, finally solves her problem, figures out how to click her heels, the ruby slippers, and takes her back to Kansas, and then she can preach to everyone what she learned, which is there's no place like home. So that's a familiar story, but it's also the story of what you do as a scientist day in and day out. Because, for example, let's say that you are, and I guess this is for the marine people since that was my area, marine ecology, but let's say you're a graduate student in marine ecology here and you go out to the Rocky Intertidal and you walk down on a beautiful sunny day and everything is peaceful and calm and quiet, and you look down on this mussel bed and then suddenly you spot a starfish, and instead of being purple or orange that you're used to, this one is suddenly green with a bunch of black spots on it. And suddenly you've now been transported into this special world. And you're excited and exhilarated. You've seen this weird starfish you've never seen before like that. But you've also now got this question, and you're now suddenly uneasy. You know, you can't relax, and that night you can't sleep, and the next morning you get up, start researching literature, and then you start writing grant proposals, you put together a whole project, and you study for the next few months or years, and finally one day you figure out what caused those black spots. And at that point you transit back into the ordinary world, and then you can start telling people about it. But what does the science world do? It immediately forces you to go to the journals and write up a paper. And what's the journal going to force you to do with their writer's guidelines? Exactly the same journey. We want you to tell the introduction of what the state of knowledge is, then tell us your methods and results, and eventually tell us what you think the answer to the problem is, and then we'll give you some space to speculate a bit and have a discussion. It's all the same story, the same basic process. So that then leads us back to look at these two disciplines side by science and humanity, with the scientific method at the core of science, storytelling at the core of humanities, and scientific method is an exercise in problem solution, storytelling is an exercise in problem solution. As my colleague Dory Barton is fond of saying, dude, it's all the same story. And she began saying this to me 5 years ago, and at first I kind of held back and said, no, I think these things are really different. But now the further I go, this is what strikes me much more, is it is all the same story, and that there's benefit to be gained by realizing that. There's so much knowledge you can get out of the world of humanities if you begin to accept that the way science is done, not just communicated, but also the whole process has evolved from the humanities. And so there's plenty to be gained from them. So that's the state of existing knowledge. Now, let me tell you some of my more or less observations, and I hope that what I present here has got a few tools that will help you, and again, not just with communication, but this is also about the doing of research. And to go back to the scientific method, this is how this narrative totally relates to the doing of science, which is there is this conundrum in the doing of science, which is that not all outcomes are created equal. And some research produces some outcomes that turns out to be a lot more interesting than other research does. And I go now and speak to lots of different groups with NIH and public health world and things like that, and hear people agonizing over this conundrum over and over again. Why is it we can get funding for this sort of stuff, not for this? And the problem is that there is this predilection towards positive results. Everybody's drawn towards positive results. They get excited about it. Journals want to publish positive results, and null results are really hard to get funded and published and things like that. This is very deep in human nature, and this is based in the world of narrative, which is people want to hear a good story. And the result of that is the occasional tendency towards false positives, the tendency for scientists to go out see a pattern that they thought existed. By the way, just on this past Friday on NPR, they had a really nice segment from a woman named Virginia Hughes talking about this a lot in the public health world, the proliferation of false positives. Everybody gets excited about, wow, you found out that this chemical causes this disease, and then people do more research and it turns out to not be the case. But these are the headlines that the journals are looking for, the magazines are looking for, the journalists are looking for. So there's the risk of false positives, there's selection bias, the idea that you've got this idea, you're so drawn to wanting to tell this good story that you're actually crafting experiments that are going to bias the way you're doing the research because you're not aware of these narrative tendencies. And the idea of idée fixate. I remember when I was a graduate student, my fellow graduate students, there were some senior scientists we could not believe they had these idée fixates. They were just positive this is how it worked, and you could not talk to them about any other perspectives. That's not the way that science should happen. Now, let me give you a different way to approach this at a more simple and kind of intuitive way of what I'm talking about. This just dawned on me a couple weeks ago. See if this makes any sense to you. You know, you don't have to be a hardcore football fan to be able to know the names of a fair number of pro football players. But the fact is, if you sit down and start making a list of all the quarterbacks that you can think of, I'm not that big a football fan, but I can give you plenty of them. Brett Favre, Peyton Manning, yada, 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 Joe Namath, Steve Young, Joe Montana. Off the top of my head, no problem. But then you try and think of linebackers that you remember, and, well, there's Ditka. And beyond that, you know, there's not a whole lot of linebackers. And then you start thinking through what that means. In the game of football, the quarterbacks are responsible for creating positive patterns. They're running all the plays and scoring the touchdowns, all that sort of stuff. The linebacker's job is to create a null result. If they succeed, there's not going to be any score. We're going to end up with a game that's 0-0 at the end, and maybe there's a field goal finally kicked that decides it. And it's defined as a boring game that nobody really wanted to go to and won't be remembered very long. What's remembered, the most famous games are almost always high-scoring games. Therein lies your basic human nature pattern, which is this tendency to be drawn to the positive patterns and be less interested in the null results, as even though they can be equally or more important. It's a dilemma. It's the way the human brain is programmed. Now, what's at stake? Why do I think this is so important? Because let me tell you this little kind of moralistic tale that I think is very sad. The most amazing scientist I ever met in my entire life, I was lucky enough as an early graduate student at Harvard University to get to spend time around Stephen Jay Gould, who I think is the greatest communicator of evolution ever. I think he was better than Darwin. He was a tremendous individual, incredibly knowledgeable. And for 25 years, he wrote a monthly column in Natural History magazine in which this was his entire thesis, his entire argument was that scientists have to be aware that you are still human at the end of the day. You are not an automaton, you're not a robot, and as a result, you fall victim to these things. He wrote essays about scientists who fell victim to false positives and idée fixés and things of that sort. The tragedy is, he passed away in 2002. In 2011, these two physical anthropologists reanalyzed his analysis of data from the most important popular book he wrote, The Mismeasure of Man, which won him the Pulitzer Prize. And what they found was, well, basically, you can read it right here in this article from the New York Times telling about their work. These physical anthropologists from University of Pennsylvania. And what this was about was Morton was a craniologist in the 1800s that Gould claimed had a bias towards, he was racist basically, that he had biased his analysis of the cranial capacity of these skulls. And that was kind of one of the core elements in his entire book. They reanalyzed his data, and at the bottom you can see, says that in an article that does little to burnish Gould's reputation as a scholar, they conclude that almost every detail of his analysis is wrong. And so he fell victim to the very problem that he was trying to warn people about, which, and again, this is a narrative dynamic. He was drawn to wanting to tell a big story. They say in their articles, it's not clear whether he did this intentionally or inadvertently. Regardless, these are things that, as a scientist, you have to develop an awareness for. And the broader dynamic in science and in communication in general is that narratives are these higher level patterns that are emerging nowadays to be more important than ever before. This is a thing we did, very simple. You may have done it before, and Google Analytics lets you do an n-gram where you can search for a word in most of the published books for the last few decades. We did it back to 1940, just looking at the word narrative. And I already knew this. The past decade, all of a sudden, everybody's talking about narratives on news shows, everywhere. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, nobody talked about narratives. Walter Cronkite, if you listen to every broadcast he ever did, I guarantee you would never hear him talking about the narrative of the Vietnam War or the narrative of the space race, anything of that sort. But all of a sudden, and notice that this kind of matches the information explosion. So as we've got more and more information, people are now being drawn to these higher level patterns, which is what narratives are. They're the threads that we see emerging over time. And I think the science world needs to spend more time now looking at these narratives. And here's something that I think is very cool as one tool to guide you into these narratives. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the greatest geneticists ever. And this is really nice because this is really kind of communications and narrative advice, but it comes from the heart of the world of science. And he immigrated from Russia in the 1920s. By the 1930s, wrote a very important book on genetics that became a part of the modern synthesis. And he also had a short quote that is often cited from him that's become very famous. Anybody in the darkness want to shout out the quote? Nice. Okay, that's good. You know, usually it's about 3 or 4% of the people. That sounded like about 10 to 15%, at least. They were brave enough to shout it out. But it is a really important quote, and I think it's something worth committing to memory. It was in my intro evolution textbook, I remember as way back in undergraduate, and I put it in my movie Flock of Dodos because it resonated with me back then in 2005 when I was making that movie. But now I've looked deeper into it, and I think it's incredibly powerful and important. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Just 3 weeks ago, an old evolutionist friend of mine tore into me about this quote and said, you know, that's just an exaggeration. There's plenty of biology that gets done that the biologists don't know anything about evolution, and it still makes sense. And that's true. You know, lots of molecular stuff, lots of physiology gets done by biologists who really don't understand evolution. Doesn't matter, their work is still valid. But I think he was talking in the larger, broader, and even almost more figurative sense, which is that you could sit there and study all these creatures and the giraffes and the ostriches and everything and be baffled by them if you do not understand how evolution has brought us all these different forms. Nothing really makes sense in the big picture unless you've got this perspective on it. So that was the title of a paper that he published in 1964 in a journal called The American Biology Teacher. But within that paper is a more detailed quote, and this is where I think it gets really interesting. So there's 2 parts to it. The first part here, seen in the light of evolution, biology is perhaps intellectually the most satisfying, inspiring science. That's pretty much the same thing as the short quote. It's the second part that's really intriguing and really powerful, I think, and useful, where he says, without that light, and I love this phrase, it becomes a pile of sundry facts, some of them interesting or curious, but making no meaningful picture as a whole. Now, let's break this down and analyze what he's saying here. First off, in the first part, he's identifying evolution. That is the narrative. That's the story of biology. It's the story of change. It is the narrative that helps us make sense of everything. And if you're up there giving a talk about all this animal diversity and you're not putting it into an evolutionary perspective, you're going to end up with a pile of sundry facts, and some of it may be interesting and curious, but ultimately they don't make any meaningful picture. And you look at intro biology books at the college level, and you know that they're all structured with this evolutionary approach. That's the narrative that helps make sense out of all of this. Now you look down here at the second part, and this wonderful phrase, a pile of sundry facts. And what he's referring to is the idea of presenting information in the absence of a narrative. And you're just going on and on, giving us more and more information. And I would suggest to you, in today's world of information overload, this is a serious problem, that people are running out of time and energy and attention to really pack in all this information. And it's up to you to figure out, exactly what is the narrative, because as he says there, you could be presenting lots and lots of graphs. Some of them may be really interesting, some of them may be curious, but ultimately, if you don't pull it together with this narrative, you're going to end up making no meaningful picture as a whole. I think it's very powerful, so much so that I would suggest the idea of adapting this as a template to use in searching for the narrative of your topic. Nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. I mentioned this to a geologist. Nothing in geology makes sense except in the light of plate tectonics. You can see all these volcanoes and subduction zones and earthquakes and everything. It all might be interesting and curious, but until you've got this narrative of plate tectonics, it's really just a whole bunch of a pile of sundry facts. And you can apply this to your own research program. You can apply it to your own laboratory. Nothing in predatory behavior of midges, assuming they are predatory sometimes. Somebody was talking about midges to me a few minutes ago. Except in the light of mandible size, I don't know. It's an exercise for you to work through. And maybe you don't get the answer to it. But these are the things you need to push yourself to find the meaning of what you're doing. This is a template that works as a tool. Now, here's a second tool that we've developed in our workshop for the past 2.5 years, and it's turned out to be, I think, incredibly powerful. So much so that I gave a TED Med talk on it last year and had a letter in Science in December of last year. And this is the idea of distilling your entire research program down to a single sentence using this template of and, but, and therefore. And people have talked for more than a decade now about the idea of the elevator pitch. And I started hearing about this a decade ago. And the elevator pitch, you all probably know, is the idea you're on an elevator and you've got 8 floors to explain to somebody important next to you what it is that you do. Well, when you start looking in these books that tell you you really need to know the elevator pitch for your research, none of them give you really any narrative guidelines. They tell you it needs to be short and punchy and the bare minimum number of words. One website proudly says it needs to be the absolute minimum number of words and not one word more, all of which is intuitive advice for you, none of which is analytical. And as a scientist, you kind of really prefer things that can give you a little bit of analytical help. And that's what this does, which is this template. For starters, I could tell you in my laboratory, we work on physiology and biochemistry, but recently we've come to realize the important questions are at the molecular level. Therefore, we're now doing the following molecular experiments and projects. That's how you apply it. And it's really worth thinking it through for whatever project you're working on, making sure if you're having any trouble at all getting it down to a place that people can really understand, this is a good starting point for you. Where this came from, for the past couple years, I've been telling people I learned it from South Park, which has been true for a couple years because they did a documentary in the making of South Park, and Trey Parker, one of the co-creators, mentioned this. He said, when I edit my scripts, I use this thing I call the rule of replacing, where I go back into the script and try and replace the word and with either but or therefore. Every time I do that, the storytelling gets more interesting. But I began researching it deeper and found a video where he mentioned that he actually learned it from one of his screenwriting professors, and then tracked that further back to, I think, what is the real source, which is Frank Daniel, one of the all-time greatest screenwriting professors. I was lucky enough to have him at USC in film school the year before he passed away. And a friend of mine found a copy of a speech that he gave in 1986, and right there in the middle of the speech is, I think, what they call the text, the absolute source. I think he's probably the guy that had this revelation. And this is from the world of screenwriting, and yet it applies to all of you every time that you're writing up one of your research papers. Here's what he said. Monotony is a problem in first drafts. There are several reasons for it. One usually is the fact that scenes follow in the forbidden pattern of and then, and then, and then. And that's a problem, when you sit there in a science talk and somebody, and here's a graph of this, and here's a graph of this, and here's a graph of this, and you can feel there's no narrative. They're not building towards anything. But the second part is where he really brings it home. Says, in such a case, immediately you have monotony. In a dramatic story, the pattern usually for the connecting scenes is and then, but, therefore, but, and towards the culmination meanwhile. If you don't have this but and therefore connection between the parts, the story becomes linear, monotonous. Now, here's the important part that's in red there. Diaries and chronicles are written that way, but not scripts. You can replace that writing, the way he said that, by saying laboratory notebooks and journals are written that way, but not scientific papers. And that's what the science world already does to you. They give you this template where you've got to take that. Virtually no journal is going to let you send in 15 pages of your lab notebook and call it quits there. Hey, I did a good job recording in the lab notebook. I'm happy with that. You all know you have to undergo this same process. And again, dude, it's all the same story. What they're doing over there in humanities, same thing you're doing there with your science papers. But this is the important point, is you've got to undergo this journey of shaping the information, and what the real world gives you is not sufficient. So this is what we now do in our workshops, and I think this is a very simple tool that I would encourage you to give some thought to. The further I've worked with this and but and therefore template, the more robust I found it to be, and I'm now working with corporations that we're doing the same sorts of things with them, with their accountants and a lot of their people who are heavily informational, finding that this is a powerful tool that's extremely simple to just get it down to this template of and but and therefore. Every story fits in there, every narrative fits in there. So what we do now in the workshop is begin by asking participants to bring in a story and we're going to go through 3 different forms. And this is kind of like the Goldilocks approach. We're going to go to the one that's way too big, then the one that's way too small, and then work our way to the one in the middle. So the starting point here, and the goal of all of this is 2 things, concision and compelling. You want to come up with a statement that is both concise, the bare minimum number of words, and yet you still want it to be compelling. So we're going to begin by not worrying about concision. We're just going to make it compelling by putting every important factoid in here. And this is from 3 weeks ago. I ran the workshop at the American Physiological Society meeting with a group there. This was one of the participants, Caitlin. And so here was her informational ABT. And try and imagine her on an elevator trying to explain to somebody, in my lab, we model moderate sleep apnea in rats with a chronic intermittent hypoxia protocol in order to investigate the physiological mechanism, blah, blah, blah. So there's no flow to it. It's not conversational. It's just a whole bunch of information. And again, this is the problem a lot of researchers get into when they're trying to explain their research to somebody. They've just got, too much information there. But this is a good starting point because you want to get at least kind of itemized there what the main piece of information that are crucial to, quote, tell the story with. Then I have them go to the other extreme, which is now I want you to take all of this, strip out all the information. I want it only to be concise. Don't worry about it being compelling. Don't worry about it, getting the story across. I just want it to be short enough that you really could have it roll off your tongue like a few phrases. And so this is, we call it the conversational ABT. And here it is. We were looking at one way, but realized there are other ways, therefore we're looking at them all as well. There you go. And, that is so devoid of information as to be largely vacuous and meaningless. And yet, you'd be amazed how many people are unable to get it to that point, because what this gives you here is the basic argument of what you're trying to get across. And you want to be able to at least be able to answer this for yourself. What am I trying to tell people? What is going on? Every piece of work you're doing has got some argument behind it. There's a bunch of people that are doing it this way, but we realized if you do it this other way, it's going to work. Therefore, we're now doing this. It's there, and you need to strip it all the way down there to get the logic, the underpinning logic. And in fact, this is conversational. In a group, you could say this, what are you up to these days in your lab? Well, we've been doing a bunch of work one way, and recently we found out there's other ways to do it, and that's what we're doing. And then people would ask you, can you tell me a little more and make it interesting actually for me? And that's the goal then. That's the one right in the middle, the Goldilocks effect, which is the keeper ABT. And so this is what I came up with for her and told her, this is what you then start to work on for the next, week or two or something like that. This was my version for her. In my lab, we're studying sleep apnea using rats as our model system, and we focused on physiological mechanisms. But lately, we've realized that the real controls may lie at the molecular level in the central nervous system. As a result, we've begun exploring novel molecular pathways. That's at least conversational. You can follow the flow of that. You might do some trimming on it. But that's a pathway to get you to this ABT, which is your elevator pitch, basically. And notice the word therefore is kind of clumsy, so you can replace it with so or as a result or whatever you want to. These are just three kind of guide words to get you to the underlying logic. And here's kind of a cool little thing that came out of this, which was a couple months ago at the Ocean Sciences meeting in Hawaii, we did our workshop, and my improv instructor that joined me on it, Samantha Roy, 28 years old, never been to a science meeting in her life, and at the end of the day, one young graduate student came up who was terrified and asked her, and she said, I have to do a poster tomorrow. I've never done a poster in my life. Nobody's given me any guidance. What do I do? And Samantha, with absolutely no background in science, like she'd been doing this for years, she said, well, it's simple. You do three things. Number one, you work out your ABT and you memorize that. And if somebody walks up to you, you say, and they say, what's this poster about? You give them the ABT, which if you follow that structure, every person will be able to understand it. And then immediately, number two, you turn it on them and ask them, what do you work on? And this is the tough part then. You have to shut down your brain worrying about your presentation and listen to what the other person says to you. Now, that's what we do with the improv in these workshops. That's why that's so important, because it's really hard when you're heavily informational. But you then listen, and then you try and pull something out of what they're doing and see if you can find the synthesis, basically. You give the thesis, they give you the antithesis, see if you can synthesize something together, some way in which what they're working on connects with this. That's a great way to open a dialogue that's not just swinging in the dark. It's at least a model for how to present a poster. And then one of the greatest things about the ABT is what we call the ABT way of thinking that emerges eventually, which is in the workshops, you begin to hear people getting sensitized to these three words. They begin to realize that the word and, when you start hearing and too much, and here's a graph of this, and here's a graph of that, an and presentation is lacking a narrative and can get kind of boring. Then they get to realize that the word but is their friend. Somebody's going on with and ands, and they finally say but, and suddenly you've flipped your mind into the narrative world, and it's suddenly interesting. And then the coolest thing is the word therefore. You start to hear people spontaneously using it as a cue when somebody is going on and on, somebody finally says, therefore, and it kind of means like, what's the meaning of all this stuff you're presenting to us? So there's power in each of those three words, which then leads me to the therefore of what I'm talking about here, pulling it all together into the synthesis. And let me give you two applications of this material in the real world, the first of which comes from just yesterday, basically. One of my good friends who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service yesterday morning sent me a rather depressed and disillusioned email about this program that they're having kind of foisted on them from an NGO, Climate Smart Conservation, Putting Adaptation Principles into Practice. It's a 227-page document. And the writing in it, I mean, let me just show you how this starts. Here's the first paragraph. Climate change already is having significant impacts on the nation's species and ecosystems. These effects are projected to increase considerably over time. As a result, climate change is now a primary lens through which conservation, natural resource management, yada, 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 yada. I looked at that, and this is what I distilled it down into to give it back to him, which is an ABT. Climate change is now happening and the impacts are widespread, but we're not sufficiently prepared for it. Therefore, we're offering guidance for designing and carrying out conservation in the face of rapid climate change. I think about 80 to 90% of the information in that paragraph is contained in that one ABT right there. And this is the challenge that you face. And this is the standard that I think needs to be elevated, is the need for concision while still being compelling. And it's the easiest thing in the world to just go on and on and on and put every piece of information in there, but that all comes at the effectiveness, the overall efficiency and effectiveness of science. So these are important pathways. And now to come full circle, like all good stories, back to where we were, I left off by telling you about the wonderful email that came back to me. And the next morning I called up Megan and said, you know, I got it. This is not meant to be. I'm really meddling in these guys' private world. I don't want to do this. And she was so nice, and she apologized. She said, you know, it never occurred to me how personal of a thing this is to get in fiddle with people's presentations. And literally, mere seconds before I was about to hang up on that phone call and we'd agreed to cancel or to just pull me out of this whole event, an email popped up from Mike Orbach, and it was one of the best emails I've ever gotten. I opened it up, and he said, Randy, last night Gary and I had a long phone call, and we decided that we're senior enough. He's 68, Gary's 70. We've done enough successful events in our lives that we can afford one giant debacle. Therefore, we are going to bite the bullet and try this crazy idea of yours out, so let's go to it. And within a few minutes, I was on Skype with him for the next 2 hours, and from then on, it was a dream come true. It was wonderful, and he had all the materials that I needed. And again, neither of these guys needed any coaching in how to be great speakers. They're both really funny and really impassioned and great eye contact and project well, all those sorts of things. They speak in nice, clean, simple language. The one thing they needed help with is the same thing that everybody needs help with, including me more than everybody else, which is with this narrative stuff. It takes a lot of effort and usually works best as a group in shaping these things into structured narratives, and that's what we set to work on. So the first starting point was, I said, that Dobzhansky template, give me the one word. Nothing in sea level rise makes sense except in the light of blank. And he agonized over that. The website, this is what it had looked like originally. The title had been responding to sea level rise, you know, pretty bland, and you probably can't read, but the second paragraph there was just basically and, a pile of sundry facts. It listed 8 different things that were going to be talked about in the event. And it would have been fine, you know, it would have come off just fine. They would have gone through a ton of information. But that's the problem here, is that in and presentations here, if you can reach the higher level of these narratives with something like the and button, therefore, you can achieve a higher level of understanding, basically, and meaning. So I asked him for the one word. He said, I can't give you one word, but he said, I can give you 3 words. And I said, that's close enough, I'll take it. And that became the title, which was New, Certain, and Everywhere about sea level rise. And I said, now we're going to build 3 stories around these 3 topics, and we're going to start by figuring out the ABT for each one of them. So for example, with new, the and button therefore was, for 8,000 years, sea level has been stable, and civilizations have built all the way down to the edge of the ocean, but in the last 150 years, it's begun to rise rapidly, therefore we need new approaches to adapt to these changes in sea level. For each of the 3 topics, there were ABTs. These are the basic descriptions of them. And we put the event on in front of 1,000 people in this big ballroom. It was a ton of fun. It went incredibly smoothly. It was dynamic. When it was over with, the first person up to the Q&A turned her back to us and turned to the whole audience and said, this is the sort of stuff we really should do more of. When it was over, the organizer came running up and said, I've done dozens of these plenary panels. You know, this one is really at a higher level. It was really fun. It just kept telling stories because we structured at different levels. And for example, once we got the ABT of each of these three things, then within them, for example, within everywhere, I began asking them, you know, can you tell me a story about sea level rise in Micronesia? And Gary says, yes. You know, there's a story of breadfruit plants, crops being affected by it. Can you tell me a story of sea level rise somewhere inland? Yes, Stockton, California, 100 miles from the oceans being affected by sea level rise. And so they had all, and so we ended up with this sort of nested structure of these ABTs, telling these stories, all of which had arcs to them, all came together, synthesized together. I ended up writing an editorial that I sent to Science. They gave it to their wonderful letters editor, Jennifer Sills, who was really skilled with narrative, and she restructured into the story of this event, and they published it as a letter in the December 6th issue. And that's what's at the core of all of that. And so, final little comment to offer up here. Quoting from Steve Jobs in the Walter Isaacson biography of him, who said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I gave a talk to a group of scientists a few months ago. At the reception afterwards, one of my friends came over to me and she said, you know, scientists think that your ABT thing is really cool and nifty, but a lot of them feel like it's just too simple for their communications needs. And, you know, imagine somebody looking at a mathematical proof that's been done in only 8 steps and saying, you know, that's just too simple. We need it to be more complex. I don't think any mathematician would be comfortable with that, and it's the same thing with communication. Complexity is incredibly easy. That's the mistake that gets made. It's so easy to just stand up there and read straight out of your lab notebook. That's the easy part. Finding this stuff and boiling it down to simplicity is the essence of it all, and again, not just in communication, but in the actual doing of science, to get the ideas shrunk down to their simple core elements. Therein lies the challenge, and that's really at the core of this whole idea of narrative, and that's why I think it's very, very important and needs to be taught. Really, I'll be advocating in this book the idea of beginning level science courses, introductory. The time has come to reach back into the humanities and pull the science world a little bit back towards the humanities because there's so much to be gained from that. It's not the same world as 30 to 40 years ago. It's time to update it in that regard. And hopefully in doing that, you'll end up pleasing Dobzhansky, who would like for you to not just produce piles of sundry facts. And I will be here for the reception and then tomorrow for a couple hours, hanging around and really looking forward to talking to anybody and everybody in these thoughts. Hopefully this is information that spreads across all 4 of the societies. It's really very broad and simple and kind of the idea of science in general. So on that note, let's see if we've got any people who want to ask some questions or comment. Thanks. Great. Great. I guess there's microphones here. People want to jump up there and say anything. The house lights are coming on. And
Here.
Remember that yes?
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was interesting and enlightening. But
I knew that was coming.
Ditko was a tight end.
Yes.
Therefore, your analogy needs to be revised.
Oh my God. Inexcusable. Ditko was a tight end. Why did I think he was a linebacker? Jiminy Christmas. Wow. So much for that presentation. Butkus, that's who I was thinking of. Dick Butkus, not Ditka. Oh my God. I just threw that together yesterday, but still, unforgivable. Thank you for stealing my thunder. And that's the headline that goes on all the blogs, was the guy finished his talk, turns out he knows nothing about football. Now, does anybody have a science world related question? Yes.
It was a great talk, and we have many facts about a lot of important issues. But to me, one of the biggest problems we have is figuring out how to interact with people who don't believe those facts. Can you tell us what your solution to that is?
Yeah. I mean, my number one piece of advice, again, is narrative and structure and argumentation, and figuring out the way to present arguments quickly, rapidly, to the point, coherent, cogent, and then digging deeper into the dynamics of narrative, which is starting to appreciate the power of questions rather than statements. And this would be a whole separate talk, and this is part of our workshop. But questions are where the power is, and questions are at the core of science. Very first thing I remember hearing when I was getting trained as a scientist was hearing senior scientists say, that person's a really good scientist, they ask good questions. It's at the core of science, and there's a completely different dynamic when you're asking questions as opposed to statements. What I have witnessed in these, quote, debates over evolution and climate science is endlessly scientists getting up there and hurling endless statements and data and information and then baffled that it's not getting anywhere. So, just look at a court trial. What does a good, attorney do? They get up there and they ask questions, and they try and probe and explore. And there are ways to confront these people whose beliefs don't conform with yours more effectively through questions rather than just lecturing them with statements. But until there's that sort of training and that sort of mode of approach, so long as everybody's so convinced that just the information is the be-all and end-all, I don't think there's any hope of ever making any headway with them. And, I can go on and on about that, but there are major TV shows going on right now that are about the issues in the world of science that are still these and presentations, which are great for the fans, the people that already love this sort of stuff. But if you look at the ratings, it will show you that just doesn't work. The power is in the narratives, the power is in the stories. That was one of the points that kind of came out of my movie, Flock of Dodos, is that these goofballs that have created this intelligent design issue are completely confused with science and all the information, but they're great storytellers. They have a good narrative instinct, and when I did the interviews with them, they did a better job of presenting things that way. So I think that this is so powerful and is not being taught enough yet. And I don't think there's an appreciation for how difficult it is. And I say that in the first person because, by the way, right now, I'm in my 5th year of making a documentary feature film about a portion of World War II that involves my father. And we have put together 3 entire movies so far over the course of 5 years. And the first couple were and things, and they weren't good. And we're finally getting there to the narrative structure where it is a clear and button, therefore. It's been such a long journey. And when you experience this stuff firsthand, you come to realize how much energy is involved in this and that I don't see that happening in the communication of science enough. So do you want to ask something further on that?
I get the narrative. I think, of
Yes.
course, you're right about that. My question, I suppose, given your answer, is how you direct questions back. In other words, what is the device you're talking about that prosecutors use that we should apply to people who live in areas that are turning into dust bowls and are 110 degrees and they don't get it?
Sure. No, and I ask you to push further on that because this is such an important issue, and it's at the core of so much, probably the most important issue the science world faces, which is that this is really kind of inexcusable. The idea that over and over again we're hearing today, 99% of scientists agree climate is a crisis, and yet the public's not buying it. I don't think there's any bigger problem with the whole science world practically right now than that. It's almost a discrediting of the entire profession in some ways with the general public. And so I would offer up 2 things. And again, the number one thing is narrative, which is, you've got to learn this approach. You've got to understand the different dynamics. Asking questions come to a lower level with these people. Spewing information at them is condescending to them. Spewing down from a high position and telling them you don't know all these sorts of facts. Asking questions comes at a more inquiring and inquisitive, and it changes the basic dynamic. So that's number one. Number 2, I usually cite Daniel Kahneman, who 2 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences ran a conference called the Science of Science Communication. He was the keynote speaker, Nobel laureate in economics. And in there, he spoke for an entire hour, got to the end, and basically turned to the whole climate crowd and said, here's the bottom line. At the end of the day, none of your evidence is going to amount to anything unless you go to the public with a voice that has 2 main qualities. It needs to be trusted and liked. And until the voice is trusted and liked by those opponents, they're not hearing anything. And that's the basic, constraint there, is that that's a communication dynamic, and you cannot send super articulate Ph.D. scientists out there into a rural neighborhood and get them to lecture to them. These are voices, these are the more human elements. So the narrative is the more cerebral side of communication. This trust and likability is the more visceral, and I just was dumbfounded when he said that in that talk to all of these heavily cerebral informational people, because he put into words the very thing that I talked about in my book, the need to get a handle on this other component, the more visceral side of it, the human side of it, and that's what you get from the humanities. So, other questions? Yeah.
So perhaps you could speak to this from your screenwriting, fictional experience, and then also the documentary factual side. When people are putting together a fictional narrative, I presume that they pick a narrative that's interesting and then select their facts, their and statements, to serve that pre-decided interesting narrative. Okay. Documentary filmmaking, or those of us in science, we start with our ands, our facts, and then we have to use those to work out a narrative that is hopefully true.
Yeah.
I think that's a very different, two different directions from the fictional side and then the reality-based side. Do you have some tips at taking a lot of your and statements, your observations that might suggest that evolution is true, and then coming up with that narrative, evolutionary synthesis?
Okay, first off, I don't see any difference between fiction and nonfiction in the narrative dynamics. It's all the same story. It all comes down to the same things. Stories consist of two elements, the structure and the character. The structure is this and, but, and therefore stuff I'm talking about here. The character is sort of what she's addressing there, the accuracy and the actual familiarity with the topic and things like that. And the very best movies are the ones that manage to go the full distance on both of those parameters. And when you look at all the great directors for fiction films, you'll find lots of them that are great on structure, but they don't care about the facts and working it in to make it real. And they're the ones that just go ahead and fudge the story and make it work. A lot of biopics sometimes will be ridiculous trying to portray somebody who wasn't like that at all. And then you find the other end of the spectrum, the guys who do a great job and lock onto the facts, but they just don't put in the effort to turn it into a good story. And again, that's why it's taken me 5 years on this documentary I'm making about World War II, is that we finally, within the constraints of accuracy and reality, we've found the core of a good story. And that's the challenge, and it mostly just comes down to prioritizing things. How much energy you're willing to put into it. Again, those two parameters, structure and character. And what you find in the science world is 100%, the total emphasis goes on the character side. We must have every single fact completely accurate, and I agree with that. But then we're going to do this at the expense of structure. We don't care if it tells a good story or not. We're just going to go through all the facts here and make sure you got it all out there. The question is, are you going to put in more resources and put in the extra time then to now take these real facts, turn it into a good story? And the problem that you face, it goes back to the quarterbacks versus Butkus, which is that the public still wants a really good story, and that's very frustrating. And I went through that myself at the Tribeca Film Festival, because I went there with my movie Flock of Dodos, and it was fun, and it was pretty much 100% accurate. I had this whole background in evolutionary ecology, and there wasn't that much information in it. But I told that film within the constraints of accuracy, and it wasn't an incredible story. At the same time, there was a movie called Jesus Camp that premiered side by side with us, and they told a fantastical story at the height of the Bush era about how this nation was being taken over by these religious indoctrination camps for teenagers, based in Missouri and in Montana and all these places. And I grew up in Kansas, and I watched that film, and it was utter nonsense. But they told a great big story, and they got theatrical distribution, and they got an Oscar nomination, and they took off. And that's the frustration, and we never got theatrical distribution, and the distributor said, well, just not enough exciting things happen in this. So you face those constraints, and it's just a question of, are you willing to kind of toe the line and go the whole distance and ultimately pay the price, which we did. I would be a whole lot wealthier today if I could have just gone for it the way that they did with their film and told big, crazy stories. So I don't know, does any of that relate to what you're saying, or ask another question? Or ask further.
Yeah, I think it relates. I was just hoping for some quick and easy tips to do that. to create a nice narrative out of your facts.
Did you see my talk? So,
Yeah,
you know,
but therefore.
that is your quick and easy tip,
Okay.
the and button therefore. And if you have a topic that you firmly believe there does not exist an and button therefore about it, send me an email. There's my email address, and I would like to hear about that because they've all got it there. But it will take you time. And this is actually the importance of physical activity, of taking walks, going surfing, as I do. Read about all the great scientists, you know, like in the double helix, they all did something physical. They went out and took long walks to think this stuff through because that pulls you down out of your brain, makes you less myopic, it spreads this is why we do improv, it's the same thing, to get out of your head, and that opens up the creativity, and you begin to spot these things and how these pieces come together. And that's the great thing about narratives and storytelling, is that it's an exercise in puzzle solving. And when you finally have those breakthroughs and realize, wait, this thing connects to this over here, you begin to solve it. But until you're into that mode where you're attacking it as an exercise in puzzle solving, you probably aren't really going down the right pathway. If all you're doing is just itemize, these are all the things we did last summer in our lab. That's okay, that's an and thing, but I promise you there's something deeper there that you can find, and you can eventually find it without having to, and of course you don't want to fudge things, it's just that you've got to dig in there and find the interesting questions. So if I had to give you a single word at the core of the whole process, it's questions. I don't think enough emphasis has been placed on the importance of questions, asking questions, understanding their dynamics, and they are the be-all and end-all of narrative. As I said, problem and solution, both of these things, it all begins with that question, like how is Dorothy going to get back to Kansas? Is that a cue? I have a question for you. Is that my cue? Great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Randy. What I'd like to say is that Randy will be available to talk to the general population here from 10 o'clock, I think we agreed on,
Sure,
until 1 tomorrow. He'll be in the exhibit hall. There is a little space set up for him. There's a poster. You'll know where to find him. Bring him some coffee. Bring him a treat. He can't walk, so make sure that we get him fed and taken care of.
Bring him a wheelchair.
Let's thank Randy again for this
Thank you.
wonderful talk. And we can adjourn to the next ballroom over. Thank you very much, everybody.
Cool. Yay. Thank you. Did I go too long?